Thank you so much, David. Well, our next guest needs no introduction, but as you heard from the minister, I'm very hardworking. So I'm going to introduce him anyway. In the past, he has been the Bank of Canada governor. He's been the Bank of England governor. He's a man who has worn many different hats. Right now, he is the UN Special Envoy for Climate Action, the chair of Brookfield Asset Management, the head of transition investing at Brookfield Corporation, and the co-chair of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And he is going to come up and give a presentation about how we put all the principles we've heard today and yesterday into action. He's also going to take questions from you. So this is where the app comes into handy. You can ask a question on Slido. And as I said, he's worn many different hats. And we're only going to ask him questions about the hats he's wearing right now, not his past hats, not future hats, current hats. Mr. Carney, please welcome him to the stage.
Merci Amber. Je voudrais rejoindre le ministre des Finances de vous remercier pour tous vos efforts aujourd'hui et je voudrais vous accueillir au Canada. Bienvenue au Canada, bienvenue à Toronto. As has been acknowledged, we are meeting today on the traditional lands of the many nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. I want to start by congratulating the Minister of Finance, Deputy Prime Minister, her Parliamentary Secretary, Ryan Turnbull, and the government for the important announcements today that will help close the gap between Canada and other nations in terms of climate disclosure and transition finance. These are timely, these are important, and look forward to people in this room and other stakeholders across this country helping to put those into action and moving forward from that. What I thought I would do today, and let me say as well, look, it's fantastic to have the PRI in person back here in Toronto. It's been 10 years, I guess. 2014 was last time you were here. David, thank you for bringing all of you here to Canada and helping to catalyze action here in Canada. You catalyze action, PRI catalyzes action. What I'm going to do in the next 15 minutes, I'll try and keep it to 15 minutes so we do answer these questions, is to take stock of what we've been trying to accomplish in this transition and what else needs to be done and where the main priorities should be. Because if I go back to what Krista just said a moment ago, quoting Olaf Scholz, this observation about this being on the scale of the Industrial Revolution, that's absolutely right. But it's the Industrial Revolution at the pace of the digital transformation. It is more than just that. I think this room understands the urgency. So some of the things that I go through, which I can do because it's the PRI and because of the expertise in this room, there'll be a few acronyms coming your way. It's not just about those acronyms, Eric. I see Eric Usher here almost in the front row. Why aren't you in the front row, Eric? There's space right there in front. These acronyms, putting them into action, making them real, and catalyzing climate action, because that is what this ultimately is about. A lot has happened since you were last here, since the PRI has last been here. The PRI has caused much of this to happen. But I think we know that much more needs to happen during this decisive decade, not over the next 10 years, but over the next 5 years of this decisive decade, if we are going to bend the arc of emissions towards climate justice. So let me begin. I'm just going to take a quick step back and frame what I think, and certainly the work that we've done at GFANZ, we did through Glasgow COP, the PRI has been very much leading on, the sort of theory of change that is here. And at the heart of that theory of change is the role for markets and a recognition that markets are one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful instrument that we as humans have created And their energy and dynamism, the energy and dynamism of markets can be used to serve great purposes. But markets don't have values. They're blind to human suffering and can ignore our greatest needs. And the challenge is to close the gap between what society values, such as sustainability and solidarity, and what the market values. And what happens is when society sets a clear goal, such as net zero, it becomes profitable to be part of the solution and costly to remain part of the problem, and private value is put in service of public values. And it's in that context that a sustainable financial system, transition finance said another way, is powerful because what finance does best is to look forward. And with the right incentives, it brings the future to the present. Remember, we're trying to solve the tragedy of the horizon, so we're trying to bring the future to the present. It can help smooth adjustment and drive growth. To be clear, and I need to always say this, lest we think that we can solve the problems ourselves in finance, we can't. Finance is a catalyst, and I know just enough of chemistry to know that catalysts only work on their underlying components. And in climate, those underlying components are the power of people demanding change, our citizens, the policies of government to incentivize action. We just heard about some of those policies from the Deputy Prime Minister, and the energy and innovation of businesses, entrepreneurs, civil society to help deliver it. And on the screen is a framework that, there's 80 pages behind this framework. I shortened it down to this, that Secretary Yellen and I worked on before she got another big job, which is to outline how credible and predictable government climate policies, credibility and predictability being crucial, the more they're that, the more investors will finance in anticipation, creating a virtuous circle of large-scale investment, greater decarbonization, more jobs, faster growth. This is what we're looking for. And there has been considerable progress putting this theory of change, if you will, into action. It's no longer a theory, it's action. Since Glasgow, with the Glasgow COP, net zero has moved from concept to commitments, with more than 90% of countries, over 9,000 major companies, and 700 major financial institutions. And that would not have been possible, I want to make this absolutely clear, that would not have been possible without PRI's leadership. And I can't list all the ways, but I'll just acknowledge with respect to GFANZ, the leadership in the core alliances, including net zero asset owners and asset managers. What we set out to do, and I mean we, the COP presidency, set out to do at Glasgow 3 years ago, was to build on that progress and have a series of reforms that change the information and the tools and the markets at the heart of finance, not on the periphery, at the heart, get rid of the labels, so that every decision, every major institutional financial decision takes climate change into account. Sometimes it'll be decisive, other times it'll be less important, but always looking at it from an optimization perspective. That means, of course, fundamentally climate reporting. It means comprehensive climate risk management and maximizing risk-adjusted returns. What's happened is climate disclosure moved quickly from being an aspiration, although quickly I say, but not quickly enough, let's be frank. From an aspiration at COP in Paris, when Mike Bloomberg and I launched the TCFD, to the delivery of those voluntary guidelines at Hamburg in G20, when Olaf Scholz was merely the mayor of Hamburg, who knew it was going to greatness. The launch of the ISSB at Glasgow 3 years ago, again as a concept then, with 40 nations, including Canada, backing it. The finalization of mandatory ISSB standards, if countries want them, last year in Montreal. And enough countries have now picked those up and said they will make them mandatory. The expectation of IOSCO is 130,000 companies around the world will be applying them in the next few years. In parallel to this, the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is a group of central banks and supervisors, started out as 8, is now over 140, covering 90% of global emissions, is subjecting the major financial institutions to climate stress testing and risk management. And so what's happening is that decarbonization is moving to become a fundamental, both in risk management and in company competitiveness, and we're starting to see it show up in expanding valuation premiums, which you'll, yeah, there you go, right on schedule. That is happening. Point being, that's progress. That's what's happened. This progress is considerable, but this room knows that it's still insufficient. The 1.5-degree carbon budget will be exhausted in the next 6 years at the current rate of emissions. And while investment in clean energy has gone from half as much as fossil fuels at the time of the Paris Accord to twice as much now, it must continue to rise sharply and be joined by serious investment, and I'll detail this in a moment, in the decarbonization of heavy industry and a belated focus on adaptation and resilience in our economies, as today's hurricane in Florida provides, unfortunately, a terrifying exclamation point. This requires, first and foremost, governments to do more. The good news is that the progress on governments, including on pledges, mean that warming could be limited to 1.7 degrees, which you'll see in a moment, but the current policies are, in the judgment of the IEA, insufficient to achieve those pledges. They've improved, but they're insufficient. There's a gap about 0.8 degrees between the policies and the pledges, and of course the pledges are not yet enough. So to close that gap, every country needs to do more, and I mean every country needs to do more. Maybe we'll cut some slack to Denmark. If there's any Danes in the audience, you've done enough, but that is literally the exception. Drive action across sectors, and the key thing is to make regular assessment of the progress on those policies, identify gaps, and then adjust. And that's one reason why GFANZ is supporting the efforts of a number of governments to embed transition planning in their economic growth strategies ahead of the publication of NDC 3.0 next year. Now, turning to transition finance specifically, the expertise of this room, I think we need to close 3 gaps: on data, on action, and on investment. In terms of data, the ISSB standards are now being implemented by jurisdictions, implemented on a mandatory basis by jurisdictions that account for over half of global GDP and over half of global emissions and almost half of global market cap. So considerable progress is being made. But to maximize the impact of that disclosure, every stakeholder, not just the sophisticated professionals in this room and at your firms, but every stakeholder should have free, readily available access to that data of companies and those progress of companies and financial institutions against their targets. So to that end, the Net Zero Data Public Utility, yes, it's plumbing and it's an ugly acronym, NZDPU, will provide the first free, globally accessible source, central source of emissions data that consolidates across everybody, limits the reporting version. The first version of that platform, which will be up and running by the second half of next year, covering 10,000 major companies, such that the question should be asked, if you're not in that database, why do you not take climate change seriously? And if you're in that database, how are you performing relative to your peers? And if a country's information isn't in that database, why are you not taking climate change seriously? And I'll add one final point, which the NZDPU is overseen by the heads of every major international organization, from the IMF to the OECD, FSB, and beyond. So that's the data gap, quickly. Action gap. Because disclosure defines the problem, action is required to address it. What we're doing on that front, and a number of you are working on this and have helped to lead it, is to mainstream the imperative, not just of taxonomies are crucial, but of transition plans. Within the financial sector, within the 700 members of GFANZ, again, supported by the PRI, and I would remind that's $150 trillion of US dollars of assets for the Canadian journalists in the room, real money, so to speak, 40% of global financial assets. More than two-thirds of those financial institutions either have transition plans today or will have them within the next 6 months. So the core of the financial system is moving to have transition plans based on the GFANZ framework, which includes, and I'll touch on this in a moment, the broad taxonomy of transition finance that's necessary. By the end of next year, nearly 8,000 real economy companies will also have Paris-aligned transition plans. And importantly, in terms of mainstreaming this, as if this weren't enough, and it's not enough, it's a lot, but it's not enough, the ISSB intends to integrate transition plans into their framework by adopting the GFANZ transition framework. And I'll just make one other point here. It took 10 years and counting from Paris to the mainstreaming of climate disclosure, because even announcements there's a lagged effect to actually being implemented. We can't wait 10 years for a plant to take the disclosure and put them into plans to reduce emissions. So government should act now by adopting consistent and comparable taxonomies and mandating transition plans for large companies and financial institutions. Yeah, thank you, that's good. I say this all the time, but the only thing I learned in the financial crisis, well, aside from don't become a central bank governor in the financial crisis, but was from Tim Geithner, was plan beats no plan. We're in a climate crisis, you need a plan to get out of it, you should have a transition plan and enact it. And what's critical on those plans is that it's all aspects of transition finance. So of course it's green energy and green power and so-called aligned activities, but it's also going to where the emissions are and getting them down, aligning. It's managing the phase out of stranded assets, and crucially, it's financing climate enablers, which mean manufacturing of solar and wind. It means critical minerals, and it means investment in new technologies. Now, last month, and as well, a crucial point, I'll make it quickly because I'm running short on time, is we think at GFANZ that it's important to track expected emission reduction. Because what we don't want for the system is, when we can't have for the system, is portfolio decarbonization. In other words, crowding in to lightly emitting sectors such as technology and leaving the problems for someone else. So the big return, and this is a room of investors, the big investment return you'll find is to go where the emissions are and get those emissions down. And in that respect, to provide some discipline to it, it's helpful to have calculations of expected emission reduction. My colleagues tell me that that QR code is going to work. You can write on the feedback forms whether it does work from there, but that will link you to a series of case studies of people putting this into action. Okay, let me speed up. Now, there's other aspects of transition planning which are crucial, and I think I just flagged that there is no net zero without nature. Agriculture, forestry, and land use currently account for one-fifth of global GHG emissions. And conversely, they're currently the sole sink for 60% of human-generated carbon emissions, and they could close 1/3 of the emission gap between now and 2030. So nature is central to all of this. And therefore, we think that company transition plans should therefore include clear policies on reversing deforestation, avoiding nature loss, and restoring biodiversity. And at COP16 in Cali later this month, we will launch a consultation on incorporating nature into transition plans. In other words, a subset of bigger set of issues around nature. We would join the ISSB in recommending that sustainability disclosures integrate the relevant work of the TNFD. One final element of closing the action gap begins, funnily enough, action begins with the passive, begins with indices. Investors use indices for various purposes, fund construction, investment decisions, benchmarking performance. But in recent years, there's been increasing demand for indices that enable investment in the transition. So we are publishing today another consultation paper on practical guidance for the development and adoption of transition to net zero indices that can support the transition. We hope many in this room will engage in this consultation and develop and design products that use these indices. Now, all of this stuff is interesting. I think it's interesting. I think a number of you contribute to it, so it is interesting. But it's only relevant if it contributes to the investment that changes the outlook. And we have an investment gap. I would simplify it into three main elements. The first is something I referenced earlier, which is just continuing to increase this pace of investment in clean energy. It is going parabolic. It needs to continue. Needs to increase by another $2.5 trillion per year, almost 2 percentage points of global GDP by the early part of next decade. That is achievable. I'll just reference that overall investment level would bring investment to GDP back to levels last seen in the 1990s, early 1990s. So the world can do this, but we need to do it to be on track. The second area is tougher in many respects, which is the decarbonization of heavy industry. Heavy industry, so think steel, cement, through to heavy-duty transportation, generates 1/3 of global emissions, and it will require hundreds of billions of dollars of additional investment every year for decades. And there are many challenges in heavy industry. The technologies, unlike wind and solar, are uneconomic at present, certainly at small scale. There are many regulatory barriers that skew incentives, and given the interconnections between sectors, slow progress in one delays progress in another. And for those reasons, at the last COP in Dubai, the Industrial Transition Accelerator was put together, and it aims to spring all of these traps by bringing together the largest emitting economies, policymakers, companies, the largest emitters, in fact, representatives of companies that represent 19% of global emissions. Over 1,300 companies are associated with the ITA, this transition accelerator. We've identified the 700 projects that have been announced or have been announced that would close 80% of the emission gap for these industries between now and 2030. But only 36 of those are operational, of those 700, and a further 42, to be precise, as of today, have reached final investment decisions. So a lot of this is intention, but not action. And in most cases, the problem is the absence of certainty around demand for the end product. So as a consequence, we are publishing later this month a playbook, a policy playbook, which sets out the critical demand-side levers from mandates to procurements that work, and we're going to work with governments and standard setters across industries to put this into place. The final investment gap is to close the $1 trillion a year gap for emerging economies other than China. And this is not hyperbole. This will require radical reform of the international financial system. In essence, what we need to do is use scarce public resources through the MDBs and the IFIs to crowd in private capital at large scale. And, my judgment, we also need to create new markets, particularly for voluntary carbon. The MDBs need to use all of their capacities to maximize total financing, not their financing, total financing to address climate change. So that's more effective use of guarantees, risk insurance, first loss structures, and originate to distribute models. We're making progress with the World Bank and the Private Sector Investment Lab. I'll give you one example. Their new guarantee platform aims to triple usage by 2030. But I'd add that now is the time for policymakers to grasp the nettle and create high-integrity voluntary carbon markets. These markets can provide hundreds of billions of dollars annually to retire high-emitting assets such as coal generation, provide financing for biodiversity and indigenous peoples. But to fulfill these roles, they need to have end-to-end integrity. That means in supply, demand, market infrastructure, and social integrity. So we need to build on the work of the ICVCM, sorry for the acronyms, VCMI, there's no QR code that explains these, IOSCO, I am encouraged, I will say this, that there is real momentum here. Nothing certain, but there's real momentum. I would draw your attention to the US government's principles on voluntary carbon markets released in the spring, the engagement of the COP and G20 presidencies, current and prospective. And for the first time, we have an opportunity to create locally connected, in other words, sovereign, locally anchored, I should say, globally connected carbon markets. Okay, I'm going to conclude and then take questions. We're all familiar with the common disclaimer that past performance is no guarantee of future returns. And this is a truism that's doubly accurate with climate. With climate change itself, past is not prologue. You know, I know from experience, a number of you risk managers know, but my experience, at least when I was governor of the Bank of England, we oversaw the world's fourth largest property and casualty market and, of course, the largest reinsurance market, Lloyd's of London. And you could see how the tail risks of the past became central scenarios of the future, of the present. We're seeing that now in, unfortunately, in extreme weather events. I also know from our work together that a sustainable financial system, when combined with ambitious climate policies and the dynamism of the private sector, can turn climate laggards into leaders. And the PRI has been at the forefront of ensuring that climate change is incorporated into investment analysis, decision making, and policies, and working across. And I think we need to ask ourselves individually and collectively whether we're fully doing enough. We need to challenge policymakers whether they are doing enough. We need to challenge our portfolio companies whether they are doing enough in managing these risks, seizing these opportunities. Because I think without question, you are the first generation, you're the pioneers, you're the first generation of investors who understand the risks associated with climate change. But you are also the last generation of investors who will be able to do anything to mitigate them. And to that end, I look forward to our continued collaboration during the rest of this decisive decade. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. That was a very insightful presentation. Now, this is the portion where
Did you like the bit where I thanked you at the start?
Yeah,
that was good.
It wasn't as effusive as the minister.
It was good. It was. It was very effusive in French, actually.
In French. So this is a portion we're going to take questions from the audience within the scope. But I want you to know, if you have anything spontaneous you want to announce, this is a safe space.
It's a safe space. I just spontaneously announced an index investing consultation with you. You can see that. Yeah, there we go. There we go. We got it.
Okay, so the first question, what specific actions would you suggest investors take in the next 12 months?
I think the next 12 months, if I were to do, let's say, three things. First, I would start to develop, if I haven't already, this approach to expected emission reduction in my portfolio. So what do I expect to get from the moment I own the asset or from this point forward? What am I expecting? And the reason I do that is it forces a conversation with the company, the underlying asset. It actually reveals value that comes with it. And sooner or later, your stakeholders are going to ask you about that. That's the first thing I do, and I can come back to that if people want in the... Don't we have a reception at some point after this?
Yes,
the reception.
Yeah,
there
you're
go.
staying for it?
Yeah, of course.
Great.
I don't need to be asked twice at receptions. Second thing, it's a little beyond the next 12 months, but I would really start to push on Scope 3. And the reason I'd push on Scope 3 disclosure is twofold. First, this is where CBAMs are going, in my judgment, it's going to be about embodied carbon, to use the term of art of the current US administration. So what are your value chain emissions? What delivered carbon in with your product and service? And that will increasingly be relevant to trade access and therefore very immediately relevant to valuations of companies. And then secondly, if we are going to have a carbon market, voluntary carbon market, it's going to be relevant to a company's ability to access those markets. You cannot have demand integrity without scope 3. And then the third thing I would do is just, and I'll just keep this at a high level, is engage with policymakers in the jurisdictions in which you operate on this point of what is the most effective policy, what's the most credible policy, because we're learning as we go, and they need to hear from this room and everything you represent of what drives decisions, what makes a difference in action.
And I know you've touched on the past about not shying away from investing in carbon-intensive areas of the market. This next question is kind of in that vein. It feels like oil companies are trying to bring the future to the present by producing as much oil now rather than later before it's too late. How can we set incentives to prevent this in order to keep 1.5 degrees achievable?
I mean, it's an interesting question, and it's an interesting question on several levels. First, of course, it's less relevant for emissions. Well, it is relevant because it changes the price, but it's a logical strategy with a stranded if you're worried about stranded assets, you want to get out first. So in that regard, it's logical. The second, so I don't think that in and of itself, it's got to be attacked on the demand side, in other words, the actual transition. Second point, I'll just make the observation that what happens in the energy sector, I put up this slide, and I think most people are familiar with the scale of clean energy investment. That is virtually all happening away from the big energy companies. They are minor players in that energy transition. So what they are effectively doing is they are producing the energy of the present and then returning cash flow to shareholders in various ways, either through share buybacks and dividends, and investing at best high single digits of that cash flow in the energy of the future. So look, I think it's not the oil company per se. It's focusing on the demand side and also the broader solutions. And if you're getting those flows back, you have to make a decision. Do you reinvest? Do you double down on the present, or are you investing in the future? I think, well, people can read charts, so you can see where it's going.
So kind of a follow-up question about the role that regulators or big banks play. What can be done from a regulatory standpoint to get our biggest banks to flip their energy financing ratios, given most banks are over-financing fossil fuels and under-financing renewables and climate solutions?
Yeah. So it's a great question, and it's one of the reasons why we have advocated, GFANZ has advocated, the publication of exactly what's embedded in the question, which what's the ratio of clean to conventional, is the way I would put it. And that ratio, I'll use IEA figures, and there's slightly different ways to cut it, but kind of a core conservative way of measuring that. That ratio has scoped up to about 2 to 1 right now, but it needs to scope up to 4.5 to 5 to 1 by the end of this decade. And so a legitimate question, and it's a question that, for example, New York Common, must be a PRI member, I would think, has asked of major banks, and you have seen in response to that, and this is an aspect of engagement, that major banks, JP Morgan, I'll use JP Morgan as an example, is now going to publish those ratios. And so right now it's the outside looking in, doing an estimate of it, but we want the proactive publication of those. And then you make a decision, because you're making a judgment about, in effect, stranded asset risk and business model of these institutions.
So on that, can decarbonization of highly polluting industries, like the stranded assets you're talking about, happen without policy and regulation that drives capital flows?
Well, I think yes and no. In some cases, it can. So, for example, the decarbonization of, in many environments, of the electricity sector, so energy generation. Look, a very profitable thing to do and good for the planet is, in many jurisdictions, is to go in and to take control by influence a mixed generation utility, so conventional, particularly if they have coal, build up clean power, shut down, use the cash flows to build the clean power, shut down the coal. Huge contribution on the emission side, and then a big valuation boost that you get from that. So in that case, in many cases, you can work through markets directly. But not everyone does. I mean, sometimes there are $20 bills literally lying on the floor, or a lot of emission reduction. But in other cases, and I reference this very quickly, we do need policymakers and standard setters to come in. So let me give an example. Am I allowed to? Can I be Brookfield for a second? Just
Sure,
to give.
yeah,
I'm going to give two
take
quick.
that hat,
I'm
put
going to
it
give
on.
two quick Brookfield examples, if I may. So on expected emission reduction, our first transition fund, $15 billion. It's all invested. A lot of it's in just straight development of clean power, but an important component is going where the emissions are, getting them down. That fund, $15 billion, will reduce over 110 megatons on an annual basis of emissions. And to put it in context, that is the annual emissions of London, New York, and Singapore and Toronto combined. Okay? So if you go where they, and you know, our investors are going to do quite well out of that fund, and in our judgment, past performance is not a guarantee for free and all that sort of stuff, but they are going to do well out of the fund. So that's one example where going in and delivering makes a difference.
We're low on time, so let me squeeze in one more question. Do you see opportunities, or can you point to examples of investment opportunities or criteria in working with Indigenous groups to create positive climate change?
Yeah, I think, well, we're here in Canada. Okay, I'm going to sneak in just one other quick answer to that last question because I knew there was 2 points I wanted to make. Very quickly, I referenced demand-side policies. So in the UK and the European Union, there are sustainable aviation fuel mandates, a certain proportion of that. The consequence of that is that sustainable aviation fuel that I used to think was a 2030s type technology is now becoming economic. And the green premium, because it's at the end use, is actually quite modest. So the point being is if you put the demand mandate at the end product, an automobile with green steel, it's 1% to 2%. It's $400 on average of an automobile if you have green steel instead of normal steel. So that's the key point on the demand mandate, and then that rolls back into investment. Look, we're in Canada. There is the road to net zero runs through First Nations lands, without question. There are very few major initiatives in this country that, or let me put it in the positive, every major initiative, virtually every major initiative in this country must be done in partnership with First Nations. And part of what we need to do as a country, and there's models for that, there's examples of that. Brookfield has, for example, power plant. Anyways, I'm running out of time. In Vancouver Island as an example. And there are bigger and bigger models. First Nations Major Project Coalition is a fantastic partner and framework for that. What we need to do as a country, given the time frames and the scale of what needs to be done, is we need to rely more on other levels of government. Other levels of government need to rely more on those partnerships and start with those partnerships, rely on those partnerships, and speed up the permitting and other process if project developers can come to a partnership with First Nation.
All right, we are out of time, Mark. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, everybody, for your questions.